It's going. And I am going to turn it over to Kelsie. Kelsie, I'm so thrilled that you could be here. I'm so thrilled that we can be talking about CWD. And please, let's get your PowerPoint going, and let's tell everybody who you are, please.
All right, I am. Let me know if you can see my.
Yep.
Can you see the right one? Okay. Sweet. All right. So thank you for having me today. My name is Kelsie, and I am part of the DNR. I am in the wildlife section, and more specifically, I'm in the wildlife health program. And so I'm a wildlife health specialist. We deal with diseases on a population level. We really don't deal with any rehab, but we do deal with things that might affect the population on a larger scale. And so we're talking things like avian influenza, West Nile virus, and today I'll be talking about one of the biggest ones in the last couple of years has been chronic wasting disease. Brief outline of what I'll be going over today. First is kind of give you an introduction as to what chronic wasting disease is and why we should care. Secondly, I'll be talking about the history of CWD here in Minnesota. I'll briefly touch on how Minnesota DNR is managing CWD within our state. And then what should hunters expect if they are hunting in a CWD area this fall? So I won't go too far into the science behind it. There are plenty of resources out there. If you want to know more about the disease itself, I'm just going to touch on just sort of the highlights. And so chronic wasting disease, as you'll hear me abbreviate to CWD for the rest of this presentation, is a progressive neurodegenerative disease. And this affects the cervid family. So this is deer, elk, reindeer, caribou, moose, and the symptoms you're going to see once they're a year and a half to 2 years into the progression of the disease is you'll see them being really skinny. They might be drooling. They tend to not be afraid of humans, and they'll sort of be walking in circles. And this is because this disease actually forms sort of holes in the brain, and it's a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, which basically means spongy brain. There's a couple different diseases that fall into this family. These are prion diseases. Ones that you may have heard of are mad cow disease, and there's a couple in humans. One is Jakob Creutzfeldt, and the other one is Kuru. Scrapie is also a common one that people hear. And again, these are all prion diseases. So they're caused by a prion, which is a denatured an abnormal protein. Prion protein. This is not caused by a bacteria or a virus. This is something that's totally different and not very well understood, to be honest. So why should we care? So CWD is spread two ways. The first one is directly. So it's spread from animal to animal via saliva or feces, urine, blood, semen. It's also spread indirectly. And so this is, those prions can be deposited in the environment at like, say, a salt block. And then another deer comes in a little bit while later and picks up those prions from that same salt block. Unfortunately, these prions remain infectious in the environment for years. If they're in the soil, they can stay for 7 years, maybe longer, maybe up to 20 years. A lot of that is still being researched at this point. They have seen that these prions can actually be picked up through plant roots that are, once it's deposited in the soil, and then live within the plant itself. And this disease was first found in the 1960s back in Colorado, and it is having negative impacts on deer populations in other states where they have high prevalence levels. And so these would be places like Wyoming or Colorado, or our neighbors over in Wisconsin. And so when I say high prevalence levels, I'm talking 50% or more. But they are seeing negative impacts on the population. And so what makes this disease so dangerous? Well, first of all, it's got a long incubation time, and this is true of all prion diseases. For CWD in particular, the incubation time is 1 to 3 years, which means these animals can look healthy, but they're still spreading the disease for a year to 3 years. There is absolutely no treatment and there's no vaccine. Once an animal has this, it is going to die, and it is going to die within 3 years. It's like I said before, it's not a bacteria or virus or a parasite. And really, the only way to get rid of prions is through incineration or alkaline hydrolysis or extreme disinfectants. Unfortunately, you can't incinerate a forest and you can't autoclave a cornfield. And so once it gets into the environment, it's really hard to get out, which is one of the main things we're trying to do here in Minnesota is make sure that this disease does not take root. And then a lot of what we do with CWD is education. And so one thing that is new to a lot of hunters is trying to understand that both freezing and cooking will not destroy these prions. As I said before, it's incineration. So the only way you're going to cook these prions out is if you have basically reduced your venison roast to ash and there's nothing left. And you would need it to be at a very, very, very high degree. Basically, you wouldn't be able to do this in your kitchen. So unfortunately, once it's in the meat, it's in the meat, and you're not going to get it back out. So a big question we get a lot is, can humans get CWD? And so to date, there is no known cases of CWD in humans. One of the other diseases I talked about, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, that's another prion disease. It naturally affects humans and about one out of a million people. And so going back to CWD, right now the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, says that it is not recommended that you knowingly eat CWD positive meat. There's a couple different studies going on where they're feeding CWD meat and brain to monkeys. The more well-known one is in Canada. In unpublished data, they have shown that those monkeys have gotten CWD. Again, this needs many, many more years of research before this is going to be, something that's certifiable, but there is evidence that it could maybe jump that species barrier. And so in order to protect yourself, you should test your deer if you're hunting in a CWD area, and don't mix your deer meats with others until you know the test results. And so process your deer individually, wait the 7 to 14 days before you get test results, and then you can make all the sausage you want. And then just to hit on, again, another prion disease, mad cow. This is one that jumped the human barrier, species barrier, and people that ate the infected cattle did develop a new variant of this Creutzfeldt-Jakob. About 200 people did die, and they estimate about 1 million mad cow cattle had entered the food chain at the time of infection. So why should we care? Well, first of all, deer and more importantly, deer hunting licenses are really important to DNR. This makes it a huge portion of our state agency. And if hunters don't want to hunt because they're concerned about CWD, we're going to lose a lot of our revenue. And so CWD means fewer hunters, which means we really don't have as much resource for controlling CWD because we use hunters to do both surveillance and to try and keep deer densities lower in areas where we know we have it. And so it's really important that DNR is invested in this and hunters are also invested in this because this is going to affect not only the culture of hunting, but also hunting, the hunting trends and the hunting for us and for our kids and for our grandkids. So how do we test for CWD? It's really hard to do this on a large scale. So there are live animal tests available, but these are really expensive and they're really hard to do. Basically, you can do a tonsil or rectal biopsy on a live animal, but that means it has to be sedated. You really can't do that on a large scale on an entire wild population across the whole state. And so here in DNR or here in Minnesota, we utilize hunters because they're already harvesting deer and it's really easy to get at those samples. So we extract the retropharyngeal lymph nodes and we ship them to a couple different labs for testing. We do 2 tests. The first is called an ELISA, and this takes a couple business days to get results back. And basically it tells us if that deer is suspect or not detected. And if that animal is suspect, we always do a second confirmatory test called immunohistochemistry. That takes about another week. And so if we do find an animal that we believe is suspect or confirmed positive, we do our best to get that entire deer carcass and the meat all the way back to the University of Minnesota in St. Paul, and it goes to their alkaline digester, which is one of the very few approved ways of getting rid of this prion. So right now we're only testing hunter harvested deer in our CWD surveillance areas. And this is because it is an expensive endeavor. And so we want to make sure that we are utilizing our surveillance and the money for the surveillance in the areas where we know we have the highest risk. So if you're hunting somewhere outside of our CWD zones, you are free to get your deer tested, but you're going to have to pay to get it done out of pocket. And if you go to the University of Minnesota, it's about $50. On the other side, if there is any instance where we have a CW suspect deer, we would always try and get a sample, regardless of where they are in the state. And so if someone sees a deer that's really skinny, walking in circles, drooling, and they report it to DNR, if we can get out there and get a sample, we will get that tested and rule out CWD to make sure that we haven't found a new infection somewhere else. And so you saw these pictures on my front slide, but I'll take about 10 seconds and see if you can guess which of these are CWD positive deer. So you might be guessing the middle one, it's a little bit skinnier. In fact, all 5 of these are CWD positive deer from Minnesota. The one in the middle is from Dakota County, and then the other ones are all down from Fillmore County, down in the southeast part of the state. Obviously, most of these deer look phenomenal. They are big trophy bucks. The hunters had no idea they were CWD positive. They got their deer tested either voluntarily or because it was mandatory, or their taxidermist helped us collect the samples. And it turns out all 5 of these were positive. And that's the problem, is a lot of these deer here in Minnesota, especially, the CWD or the CWD is so new that we are not seeing a lot of the really sick deer. This is we're seeing really low prevalence. It's a relatively new disease to our state. It's relatively rare. And so when we do find positives, they tend to be looking really healthy. They haven't really gotten to the end stage of the disease. Unfortunately, all these animals are still spreading around the prions as they move around and interact with other deer. They just don't look like they're sick. So now I'll go into some history about CWD. So we started surveillance for this disease back in 2002, and this was initially prompted by discovery of CWD both in Wisconsin and at a positive elk farm in Aiken. And so over the next 3 years, from 2002 through 2004, we tested 28,000 deer across the state. It was a statistically significant base design, and we had no positive detected. So we were very confident that this disease did not exist in Minnesota. We did a lot of surveillance and we didn't find it. And since then, we have been doing risk-based surveillance since 2005. So once we had our baseline and we knew it didn't exist in the wild, we wanted to adjust our surveillance based on risk. So that means we are going to collect samples from deer, do a couple of things. First, suspect deer, I already said, if we see any deer that the public calls in that is circling or really skinny or it's acting strange, if we can get out there and get a sample, we will test it. Secondly, we will do surveillance if there's a new infection found. And this can be in an adjacent state. We've done this several times because of infections found in Wisconsin. Or if there's a new infection found in the wild here in Minnesota. And then finally, we do surveillance in association with a positive deer farm. So since 2002, we've had 12 positive deer farms, and we've done surveillance for a couple years at a time around each of those farms to make sure it has not escaped into the wild. So to date, we've had 118 positives in 6 counties. Our first one is in 2010, and our next wild deer was not found until 2016. So in this map over here on the left, all of the counties in green are where we've had positive deer farms. We've also found wild deer within a couple miles of a few of those farms. The majority of our disease is in the southeast. We had 1 case in Crow Wing County in 2019. We've had 5 cases in Dakota County since last year. And then the majority of them are in Fillmore and Winona County. As I said before, we've had some positive deer farms. It's been a total of 12. The most recent one was in Beltrami County, and I'll have some slides on that in a little bit. All right, so in this, I told you the majority of the disease is down in the southeast. So let's kind of focus in and see what we're doing with prevalence down in that part of the state. So although that's where the majority of our disease is, prevalence is still low. This is our apparent CWD prevalence in the deer permit area that basically encompasses Fillmore County. And so 2016 is when we first found it, and we've been doing surveillance since then. And then although it looks like there's been a slight increase in 2020, really there's been no significant increase over the past 4 years. We're still staying right around less than 1% if we're looking on a countywide scale. And it appears to be persisting in this area, and it is slowly spreading outwards. We're seeing some slow spread from that initial core around Preston, both to the north and out farther to the west. So what is DNR doing about this disease to manage it? So number one is find the disease where it exists as early as possible. And so the slides I just covered kind of went over that. So since 2002, we have tested over 90,000 wild deer. We found 118. We are very confident that this disease did not exist in the wild. We sometimes hear you're only finding the disease because you're looking for it. Well, we're looking for it, and we have not found it until once in 2010 and not again until 2016. Secondly, Minnesota DNR wants to limit the transmission and spread of the disease once we find it existing in the wild. And so there's a couple ways that we go about doing that. The first is to reduce the human facilitated deer contact. We try to prevent the movement of infected deer carcass parts, and we remove CW positive deer from the landscape. So I'm going to touch on this first one, reduce human facilitated deer contact. So in different parts of the state, based on risk, we have implemented deer feeding and attractant bans. And so basically we're trying to reduce artificial concentration of deer. We don't want these deer all grouping together around a salt block or some deer corn and potentially spreading prions to each other. Same thing with attractants. We don't want deer coming into the same, urine bait or whatever you're doing, the urine attractant. So we've eliminated or we've banned both feeding and attractant in some areas, and then just feeding in other areas. Because of the Beltrami County positive farm, there will probably be an expansion of deer feeding in that area, but we're still waiting for the final ruling on that. All right, so next I'm going to talk briefly about preventing the movement of infected deer carcass parts. And this is really important because the two biggest risks to spreading CWD is movement of both live cervids, which both the cervid industry and wildlife agencies both do, and the movement of deer carcasses and their parts, or elk carcasses or moose carcasses, basically cervid carcasses. So since 2016, Minnesota has implemented a carcass import ban, which means you cannot bring a whole cervid carcass into Minnesota from anywhere in North America. You can bring back the meat, you can bring back finished taxidermist mounts, you can bring back quarters, you can bring back the antlers, the hide to do a taxidermist mount here in Minnesota, but you cannot bring that whole carcass. We want that head and that spinal column to stay where that deer was harvested or where that cervid was harvested, and make sure we're not potentially bringing any disease back here to Minnesota. And to illustrate that, here is a map of the 4 counties in Wisconsin that have the highest prevalence of CWD, and these are Iowa, Dane, Richland, and Sauk counties. Here's a picture of everyone who harvested a deer in that area lives. So if all of those hunters who harvested deer in those 4 counties brought their deer carcass home, how many positive deer would have been brought home? Prevalence in those 4 counties is upwards of 50% for males. And we know that CWD testing is not mandatory there. And so many of those deer were not tested. And so if hunters are bringing those deer home without testing them, they are potentially bringing CWD positive deer back to their home state. Again, this is older data. This is from 2016, 2017, but it still illustrates the huge risk that hunters are potentially bringing when they bring a whole carcass back into the state, which is why we've enacted that ban. To help educate hunters, we've contacted 12 states where there is high CWD prevalence, and we've found the addresses of Minnesota hunters who go out of state to hunt, and we've sent over 30,000 letters to explain the ban and just make sure that people are aware of the fact that they cannot bring a whole carcass back into Minnesota. They can bring parts, but they cannot bring the whole thing. We've also made a couple videos, how to cape your deer, how to quarter your deer, and these are to help hunters figure out to make a plan ahead of time. So if they do shoot a trophy, they can bring that trophy, the correct parts back into Minnesota. And so just remember the risk is low when you quarter your deer and go. And then within Minnesota itself, we have a couple carcass movement restriction areas. And so in management zones where we know the disease exists in the wild, we have enacted both management and control zones. And so you cannot bring a whole carcass out of that zone until after you get test results of not detected. And so to help hunters be able to facilitate this, we have put out dumpsters and tripods in certain areas of the state so that hunters can quarter their deer. They can take the quarters home, but then that head and spinal column is going to go into that dumpster, and it does not go home and potentially infect a new county here in Minnesota. These dumpsters and quartering stations are provided by DNR. They give hunters a couple options. If you'd like to know where these are, and if you're in an area that has carcass movement restrictions, you can check out our website, mndnr.gov/CWD. And then several of you may have heard about the new Beltrami County, or the new Beltrami deer farm. And so in April 2021, we discovered that there was a new CWD positive farm. We also found that there was an illegal carcass dump on nearby county land. And so carcasses coming from the CWD infected farm were put out on the landscape. About 10 to 12 carcasses were discovered, and then University of Minnesota scientists went out. They have a new test that they're working on, and so they think that several of these likely contain CWD prions. So Minnesota DNR erected a fence around where this dump was, and so this fence cost about $200,000. It is designed to last 20 years, so all of the vegetation has been mowed down on either side. So if it's really windy, if a tree blows over, it won't knock the fence down. And basically this prevents deer from going inside the fence. This is designed to last for 20 years. It'll keep deer out and hopefully keep prions in, and then, hopefully reduce the risk that carcass dump had potentially caused. And then finally, one more thing that DNR does to limit the transmission and spread of the disease is we're trying to remove CWD positive deer from the landscape when we can. And so in the areas where we know the disease exists in the wild, we have a couple options. We've increased bag limits, we've expanded hunting opportunities through disease management tags or late hunts, and we also utilize targeted culling in areas where we know that the infection is persisting. And these are right in core areas, right around Preston where we know the disease exists. This wouldn't be used on a large scale. This is used in very tight clusters where we have several positives. And so this is just a couple more tools we have to try and to combat the disease. So if you're a hunter and you are hunting in a CWD area this fall, what can you expect? Well, first of all, we're doing CWD surveillance across 6 areas of the state. 5 of these areas have mandatory sampling. And so the only one that doesn't is this one over here, DPAs 213 and 273. They're doing a risk-based surveillance, so they're doing more of a point model. This is a pilot to see if this will be a good way to do surveillance in the future. But for everyone else, all the rest of these deer permit areas, there will be mandatory sampling over opening weekend. If you are in one of these orange or yellow zones, you can get your deer sampled on a voluntary basis throughout archery and the rest of firearms or muzzleloader by visiting a self-service sampling station. So we have these set up at different locations. And if you're in a surveillance zone, which is these gray deer permit areas, you can make an appointment with your local area wildlife office to get your deer tested outside opening weekend too. So you also have options. They're just not self-service. You just have to make an appointment. So if you are in an area that has self-service stations, this is how you use them. They're basically a big barrel with a map attached to it. And so you're going to cut the deer's head off. You can do this before you get to the station. You can keep the antlers. So cut the antlers off if you want to keep them. You don't have to give them to us. We don't return heads. So whatever goes into the barrel will eventually go into a dumpster. So you'll bring your deer head in. You're going to fill out one of these red tags, and these are available at the site in this little toolbox. Basically, we need some contact information from you so we can contact you if your deer is positive. And then we also want to know where you've harvested it. And so this one, we want you to look at the map. It's on the back side of this plywood. It's 4 feet by 4 feet. And we want to know down to the township, range, and section. This is a 1 mile by 1 mile block as to where you harvested your deer. And then you're going to cut a hole in your deer's ear. You're going to use a zip tie. Again, we provide them. And you're going to zip tie this tag to the ear of your deer. You'll drop it in the bucket, replace the lid, and then we come check these every couple days to get them processed and shipped off to the lab. So for opening weekend, as I said before, there's going to be mandatory sampling. We are going to have a mix of both staffed and self-service stations available at 87 locations. And this is because we have a huge need for staff. This is the biggest CWD surveillance we've ever done. We need over 500 staff and students, and we basically just don't have enough personnel to staff all of these. We also want to make sure that there is options available for people who still have COVID concerns, so that you don't have to interact with staff. You can still get your deer sampled. You'll just have to do it on a self-service basis. You're still abiding by the regulations. You don't have to come to a staffed one, but it does provide another option for hunters. If you would like to look at these locations, you can go to our DNR website, or they are also listed in the regulations book. We are hoping to collect around 22,000 samples this fall over opening weekend alone. This is about 90% compliance. So if we can get more than that, that's great. It means harvest was up and people were successful. But this is very, very, very pricey. It costs a lot to get this surveillance underway, but this is, we need to be protecting our wild deer herd. We need to be able to know where the disease is at and at what prevalence. And so it's really important that this is a section priority, and it needs to be a priority for hunters as well. So if you're in a CWD area for opening weekend, you have to register your deer as normal. So just because you're getting your deer sampled doesn't mean it's registered. So those are two separate things. So register your deer first, and then come visit us at the sampling station after that. We always encourage hunters to process the deer as they normally would. Keep your meat separated before you get test results back. Hold off on making sausage until maybe, the next weekend. If you're in an area with carcass movement restrictions, you'll have to abide by those. So either find a meat processor who's willing to take your deer. I will caution that a lot of them are doing domestics, or doing a lot of pigs and cattle right now, and not very many of them are doing deer anymore. So call ahead, or be prepared to quarter your own deer and take those quarters home with you. Make sure you're complying with any mandatory CWD testing. As I said, you can either use a self-service station, or we do have in-person staff stations as well. If you're visiting a staffed in-person station, keep your deer head towards the tailgate. It's much easier for us if we don't have to clamber into, the back of your truck and unpile your 6 deer to be able to get at the neck. That's where we'll be taking the samples. But keep the heads towards the tailgate. It'll help speed things along. Make sure your hunting license is easily available, because we'll need to reference that for your license number. And also know where you hunted your deer. A lot of people may go out with a buddy and just they follow their buddy, they shoot the deer, and then come to the check station and said, I have no idea where I harvested it. So just know where you harvested the deer, so that it's much easier for you to point at a map, and we can get you through the process really quickly. Results will take 7 to 14 days. We're shipping off to 2 different labs this year. One is in Colorado and one is in Wisconsin. And this is to speed up test results. If we send 22,000 samples to one lab, they will obviously get bogged down and can't process them that fast. So we do ship to 2 labs to try and speed up our return time. And you'll be able to use your license number from your hunting license to look at your own results online. So you can go to mndnr.gov/CWD check. You'll type in your MNDNR license and be able to check your results right there. We only call if your deer is CWD suspect or positive. So generally, no news is good news, but you can always confirm yourself online if you want to know for sure. So what if you have a trophy? Well, if you have a trophy, we're very excited for you, and CWD sampling will not interfere with that. We will totally work with you to make sure that you can have the best hunting experience possible while still abiding by DNR regulations. Option 1, if you're going to do a European mount, which means just the skull with antlers, bring it in to our stations and get it sampled. This doesn't affect anything with the skull. We're only cutting through soft tissue. You'll still have your trophy, and you'll be able to be on your way. If you want to do a shoulder mount, we have a couple options. First, you can come to a check station. Just warn the students working at the station that it's a trophy and you don't want to have a sample right now. We are having students from 12 different universities, and they're very excited. But just be kind of warn them, be like, hey, I'm just here to get this inspected by DNR staff. I'll be bringing my deer back later. And so you'll come to the station, you'll say, I want to get a shoulder mount, and the DNR staff will go with you, go over a couple options with you. The first is we're partnering with taxidermists in a couple areas of the state, and they will actually cape your deer and take the sample and then bring it back to Minnesota or to DNR. And in that case, you're done. But if you have your own taxidermist you want to use, or it's someone who's outside of our partner program, you're going to have to bring that caped out head back to a DNR office. Or to a self-service station. And that's totally fine. You have, a couple weeks to get that done. But we're going to fill out some information ahead of time. So then if a conservation officer stops you and says, why is your deer not sampled? You can say, nope, I stopped at the check station. Here's all my information. I got it signed off. I have a plan. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get the sample to DNR eventually. And so, this is all make a plan. Be prepared to shoot that trophy. It's, just if you are going to show your trophy, have a taxidermist in mind. If there are carcass movement restrictions, you can't take that deer out of the zone. You're either going to have to get it caped out or have your taxidermist come into the zone to cape the deer for you. So just making sure you're abiding by those carcass movement restrictions where they exist. So in summary, what does CWD mean for me as a hunter? So again, CWD has not been shown to infect humans or cattle, but the CDC still does not recommend you eat a known positive deer. If you are hunting in a CWD area, keep hunting. Number one, that's the most important. There are plenty of precautions we can take to still make this, as safe as possible. The number one is get your deer tested if you're in a CWD area. Don't mix that meat together until after your test results come back. Again, it should only take 7 to 14 days. I hope you can hold off on making sausage for at least 2 weeks. Avoid eating the tissues that are going to have concentrated prions, and these will be the brain and the spinal column and the lymph nodes. Maybe opt out of that neck roast, or if you want the neck meat is still fine, just don't do that neck roast that still has the spinal column still intact. There is new research coming out that shows if you clean your stainless steel tools with 30% bleach water, that should denature the prions. So it's one way that you can, disinfect your tools between deer. We have a lot of public resources, and we're going to point you to our website most frequently, because this is where we can update information all the time. The regs book we wrote back in June, and so I know of at least one station, Kellogg, has already closed down, and so that information is on the website, but we can't take back those regs books and reprint it. So to have the most update information, go to our website at mndnr.gov/CWD. You can see station locations, station hours, dumpsters if they're in their area, local taxidermists. You can check your test results. And we have lots of videos on how to gut your deer, how to cape your deer, how to quarter your deer, and how to use a self-service sampling station. We've tried to make it as easy as possible. So just visit our website, mndnr.gov/CWD. Here's what it looks like on the test result page. You'll be able to look at your own individual results, and then you can also look at test results for other areas, including your own, to see how it's doing. Has there been any recent suspects? Is there any confirmed positives? How many samples have come in? You can also see this interactive positive deer map, and so you can see the counties where we've had positives, and then the counties, where are they sort of grouped? Where are we finding these positives on the landscape? And so, in summary, for my final slide, I just want to touch on a couple things. So first of all, CWD is still a rare disease in Minnesota. It's a very important disease, and we do not want it taking hold, which is why we're dedicating so many resources to fighting this. But it's still relatively rare. And so as a hunter, like I said before, keep hunting, get your deer tested. But really, this is affecting less than 1% of the deer population, and that's in Fillmore. The rest of the counties are doing so much better. We are taking an aggressive approach to this. We're really concerned about the deer population and hunting heritage. And so there, as I said before, there's a lot about this disease that's still not known. It was only first discovered back in the 1960s. So as more science comes out, we're going to keep adapting our plan, and we're going to be adapting our management to be as effective as possible. And so what we did back in 2010, we might be doing differently now, and we'll be doing differently in 2030. But that's how you have to work with a disease that is still, being researched, and there's still so much that we're learning about it on a year-to-year basis. And then finally, we're not going to be successful in this if we don't have the support of hunters and cooperators and businesses. And so, keep hunting, keep encouraging your friends and family to hunt, get your deer tested, abide by the carcass movement restrictions. It's going to take all of us to fight this disease. But I think, we're doing a great job. It's still relatively rare. We've done a good job of preventing spread throughout the rest of the state, and we need to keep that ambition going. And so with that, I can answer any questions that might be in the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Kelsie. We do have some questions. Before we get into the questions, I want to give folks time to take down your information if they want to get in touch with you directly. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that when I first learned how to deer hunt down in Georgia, there are certain things that you just do when you're not in a CWD area. So when I learned how to deer hunt, we cut through the pelvis when we were gutting the animal. We cut up the sternum of the animal. We were cutting through bones left and right. We were taking out neck roasts. And when I got to Wisconsin, I hunt in Sauk County, which is right across the river from ground zero for Wisconsin. And it changed dramatically. I quit doing all of that stuff, right? I quit cutting through bones, and you don't necessarily need to. It just kind of makes it a little easier. It's a little quicker, and it's just how I was taught. So, in these days, so I no longer cut through the pelvis to gut an animal out. I no longer saw through the rib cage to cut an animal out. I no longer take ribs off the body. I no longer use those neck roasts. I just bone everything out and just have the meat. So in addition to being aware of what's out there and how it's moving and what it's doing, there are steps that as hunters, if you're hunting in an area that has CWD and you're concerned about it, the best practices that you can take, it is going to involve some behavior changes. It is going to involve some adjustments, but they're, in the grand scheme of things, they're pretty small adjustments. So, for example, one of the adjustments that I've made is that I change the knife that I take out into the field. So instead of having, my grandfather's knife that means the world to me and has a lot of sentimental value to me, I take a very inexpensive, completely stainless steel skeletonized knife that I can just throw into a bucket of bleach as a sterilization method that otherwise would ruin a knife that means something to me. So these are really easy steps that people can take to adjust, and it doesn't change the fact that you can still put an animal on the ground, you can still get it out, you can still get it in your freezer. Another adjustment is, there are a lot of hunters. Um, as a matter of fact, it wasn't until I went up hunting up north with my Northwoods guru, the legend Craig Kiger, where his wife was fortunate enough to put a deer on the ground, and we had tenderloins that night. And I told him, I was like, I haven't had non-frozen venison since I was a kid, because that's not something we do in a CWD area, or what we did in Wisconsin where I was hunting. Everything was packaged and it was frozen, and we waited on the test results. And it's an adjustment, but it knowing what those test results are when they come back, it's a big thing to me. I mean, I'm relieved to 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 know whether or not those deer are testing positive. And back in 2015, I did have a deer test positive, and throwing out 85 pounds of meat that I butchered myself was a gut-wrenching thing to do, but it was the right thing to do for me. It's not
Yep.
something that I want to. It's not something I want to eat. I don't want to feed it to my family. I don't want to feed it to my friends. So um, it's there, and like you said, this thing's going to evolve. It's going to change. Our response is going to change. Our knowledge is going to change. So folks, this is something that we are going to adjust with as we move forward.
Hmm.
That being said, uh, we do have some questions, and they're covering a variety of topics. One is kind of a logistical one. Half of my permit area is in voluntary testing, but I hunt in the part that is not voluntary. Would I have to pay to have my deer tested, and should I be getting it tested?
So that's a great question. So I will say that there are some deer permit areas that are cut in half. It is still mandatory opening weekend if you're in one of those halves that is included in the surveillance. If you're hunting in the half that's not included in the surveillance, you would have to get that. You would have to pay out of pocket to get that tested. If it was me personally, I probably wouldn't do that. We have evaluated and felt that the risk is low enough that your part of the DPA was not needed to be part of the surveillance. So if you're talking about, I'm trying to think of one. I don't want to be misquoted, so I'm going to look at a map. If you are talking about like DPA 169, which is a half DPA, and you're outside of the surveillance area, I would be fine eating the deer without getting it tested. And again, you'd have to get that tested out of pocket. University of Minnesota has testing abilities. Another one is Colorado State. You can actually ship it out of state. You can ship it to them. And both of those websites and links and how to do that is available on our website, mdnr.gov/CWD. You can go look at both of those labs and how to get your own personal deer tested.
Awesome. And yeah, for everybody on the call, I just put in a bunch of links as Kelsie was wrapping up her talk. Our CWD landing page is there. Our interactive CWD testing map page is there. So we've got a bunch of links in the chat. Please open them up, bookmark them, make sure you know what you got. And on our Learn to Deer Hunt page, we've got videos we've got a video that Kelsie and I did on that gutting method that only involves you don't need to cut through anything. So I'll put that in there on our Learn to Deer Hunt from last year webinar series, and there's videos in there for that too. Next question, and this is one that we probably can't really dive into. The question's about, what happened to the deer farm that was dumping carcasses. That's an ongoing thing, and it's not really something that we can speak to. I appreciate the question, and it's a question that I think is a very is very much at the forefront of a lot of people when we're talking about that. But that's still an evolving situation, and we can't really speak to the outcome of that just yet because it hasn't fully been resolved. Is that fair to say, Kelsie?
Yeah, I will add to that. As soon as it was found positive, they were given indemnity money for the remaining deer on the farm, and all those deer were euthanized and tested, and there was more positive deer on the farm itself. But at that point, that farm has now no longer has deer. They have all been euthanized. So.
Okay. Um, Next question, are infected deer carcasses or heads that are tested incinerated? How does the DNR prevent the spread of test positive carcasses? And you touched on this in your talk. You talked about the alkaline digester,
Yep,
correct?
but I can talk about it again. So, as soon as we find out that an animal is suspect, we call the hunter right away, and we want our first question is, where's the rest of the carcass? If it's down in the southeast, a lot of the times the hunter will respond, "Oh, I put it in the dumpster," which is great. There's really two places we want positive carcasses to go. The number one, the best one, is to go to the University of Minnesota, go into the alkaline digester, which basically it's like a pressurized cooker that turns like an entire cow into like a handful of ash. It's a super intense, but that's one way that we can deal with prions. So that's the optimal thing. The second best is a lined landfill. And so lined landfill means it basically has a clay liner. And so one thing that they have seen recently in CWD research is that if prions are moving through the soil, if you have a clay liner, those prions actually absorb to the clay and they don't move down into the groundwater. And so if we can get those carcasses to a lined landfill where they get buried and a scavenger can't pull it farther apart, that is ideal. So that's one of the reasons why we have these dumpsters, is because if positive carcasses go into them, then those carcasses end up at the landfill before we get test results back. That's just fine. They're all going to approved landfills. They got the liner in them, that clay liner. And so that's one way that we're protecting the landscape even more. Um, so we're not testing the carcasses themselves, but we are. If the deer is positive, we want to know where the carcass went. If it's still on the landowner's property, we meet up with him. We grab the rest of the carcass. We take it up to University of Minnesota and we dispose of it that way. So those are really the two best options for CWD positive carcasses.
Nice. This next question is also a topic that I think is close to your heart. Should we be concerned about unknown infected deer moving to an uninfected area, i.e., what is the average range of a deer? And I'll let you speak to that, and then I'm going to follow up. So go ahead.
Okay, so there is a study going on right now, or just wrapping up in the southeast part of the state, called the Southeast Deer Study, and it's on our website. I might be able to find the link if I can't multitask, but we'll find the link. But basically, we put GPS collars on deer, and we wanted to see how far they were moving, especially ones that were in the CWD area. Like, how far is the average distance moved? It's really only a couple miles. It's not that far. We were capturing these deer as 8-month-old, and then we wanted to see, as soon as they turn a year, mom kicks them out and says, "Get out of here, I'm going to go have more babies." So that's when we start to see the yearlings have their first dispersal. And then we also wanted to look at bucks and see how often and how far bucks are moving around during the rut, and potentially, how far could they be spreading the disease. And so we're wrapping up that study. There's going to be, I think, a summary, maybe like a one-page summary that'll be out, but there are anomalies. We did have one deer that moved like 90 miles, but for the most part, they only move a couple miles. And so we can't really put a fence around a whole CWD area. Fences don't really work. You just can't put a fence that's going to keep wildlife out, and you really don't want to, because we don't want to interrupt other wildlife. And so that is one reason why we have the control zone around the management zone. We know the disease exists in the wild in the management zone. We've enacted that control zone around the southeast as sort of a buffer. We want to make sure that if deer are moving up and out of the CWD area where it exists now, we're going to catch them, because we have mandatory testing. We have dumpsters available in that control zone. And so it's just an added tool that we use when we have a persisting infection, where we know that this isn't just a one and done, that we should be concerned about it. I will say, not because I just thought of it, we are very lucky. We've had a couple one and dones. The first one was Pine Island. We had one positive deer, which was found a couple miles from a deer farm. We did testing for 3 years and we never found another one. Same thing with crowing. We found a positive wild deer about you know, to 1,000 feet from a deer farm fence. And we've been testing since 2017. That was the only one we found. If we find nothing this year up in Crow Wing County, DPA 604 will be dissolved and we'll go back to the normal DPAs that existed before. And so it's in the CWD world, that's called like a one and done. So we looked really hard. We used a couple different tools. We had agency calling up in DPA 604 the first year. We had increased bag limits. We had disease management tags, and we had mandatory testing for either whole or partial seasons since 2019, and we have not found any other than that first one, which was found over the winter. And so that's great. That means that we get to dissolve that. If, knock on wood, we find nothing this year, everyone participated. We worked really hard. We made sure that that disease didn't spread anywhere else. So we're going to keep rooting for more one and dones if they continue to pop up.
Nice. And yeah, so I'm glad I let you speak, because I went ahead and put the link to that movement study in the chat, so folks can see some of the great maps and some of the great work that's been done on that movement study. Really interesting stuff. Let me see. So really quickly, and Kelsie, just to be blatantly clear, DNR doesn't have jurisdiction over the CERVID operations.
We have joint authority. So Board of Animal Health and DNR recently were given joint authority. That's honestly the most I can speak to it. If you do have questions about DNR's joint authority, I have two names, Chris Balzer and Rob Gorecki. They are sort of taking the forefront of this. Right now, we're still in a learning phase, so we're learning a lot from Board of Animal Health. We're learning about inspections. We have 40 inspections we were trying to do before the end of the year. We're on track to get those done. And so basically we're learning how joint authority could possibly work between both Board of Animal Health and DNR, and this is for white-tailed deer farms.
And that's a new development.
It's new within like the last 6 months.
And so like any restrictions that are being put into place with that industry, that's really a question for the individuals that you mentioned. Could you repeat their names?
Yep, Chris Balzer and Rob Gorecki, and they're both with DNR.
Okay. So if folks have questions about what restrictions are being put into place for those CERVID operations, how that joint authority is going to operate, please reach out to those individuals, and they can speak more accurately to that, because Kelsie is very much on the wild side of things, like the unfenced deer side of things. So we don't want to be giving out the wrong information or confuse anybody. So there was one comment in the chat that I tried to get to, but I want to make sure that that you address it. The difference between a prion and something like an internal parasite, so like brainworm. I mean, they're very different. The outcomes may have some similar manifestations, but the actual thing is a different thing.
Exactly. Yep. So prion is brainworm is caused by a worm. And so with moose, it makes them, walk in circles, which CWD and deer, you're going to see them walking in circles. And so that is about as similar as they get, because they both affect the brain. They're two very different diseases. One is very infective. The prion disease is super scary and very infectious. Brainworm is also a huge concern for our moose population. There's actually brainworm in deer. It just doesn't affect them negatively. So they live with it and it doesn't affect them on their day-to-day life. And so that one's a little bit harder because you can't necessarily keep moose and deer apart. Whereas, this prion disease it's just a different story.
Yeah, excellent. A couple of questions in the chat and then the Q&A about, when is this video recording going to be available? There's two ways that you can do it. If you go back to the registration page, it's going to be ready probably by the end of today or tomorrow morning. But if you need captions or if you need closed captioning, that's going to take a little bit longer because we have to, there's stuff that we have to do to make it ready for our YouTube channel. But we have these posted on our YouTube channel on the landing site that I put up at the top of the chat at the beginning of the webinar. That should be up by next week. So if you've got stuff that folks that you want to share this with, or send it out. Those are the two ways that you can get to it. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or the Q&A. So, I think we're coming up. It's 10 to 1. I think we can wrap it up. I really appreciate everybody coming and tuning in. Kelsie, thank you so much for sharing the information with us. Like I said, next week we're going to be talking about firearms deer opener. It's going to be me and Craig and a conservation officer to discuss, what do you need to do? What do you need to have done? If you're thinking about firearms deer opener, get out there now. Do your scouting now. Do your make sure your firearms sighted in. Make sure you've got ammunition to go
Buy
out.
your ammo now.
Yeah, buy your ammo. Buy it wherever you can find it, because it is bleak out there. If you've got a buddy that's been sitting on some stuff, now is the time to tap them on the shoulder and ask them for some help, because it is bare shelves in a lot of spots. I put in a link for your make a plan, and that kind of goes through every DPA so that you can find out what is affecting that specific deer permit area, and get on it, because especially with this colder weather coming through. And with the rain that we've been getting across the state, I expect stuff's going to be moving, and stuff's going to be hopping here pretty soon. So, Kelsey's out a little bit out of the metro. Are you seeing any bucks running around yet, or?
Yeah, when I drive into work, it's about 45 minutes into work, and I have been seeing them. Yep.
So it's, we're probably at the very beginning of that pre-rut sort of activity period for the males, and so yeah, now's the time to get out and get on it, because opening day is right around the corner. So get out there and have a blast. And we'll get into a lot of the stuff, with the deer hunting stuff. We'll be answering those questions next week. And a couple of last second things came in the Q&A and chat. Is the GPS on your phone accurate enough to locate the harvest location? That's a great tip, and I was thinking it when Kelsie was talking about it, and then other stuff happened. So Bill, thank you very much. Absolutely. If you've got your phone on you, you don't need cell signal to put a GPS point down. You can put it down, and you can mark a location frequently. So yes, if you have your
And
if
if
you
you
have
have Onyx Map, if you touch where you harvested, it'll actually pull up the township range and section for you on Onyx Map. You can also do that through the DNR has an app called Rec Compass, and it'll do the same thing, which is totally free. You can use that. And again, you don't have to know your exact GPS point, just long as you know, okay, I went up this road, turned left, and went around this lake. Okay, then you can zoom in on a map and touch. That's what we need to know. So, but if you hunt with a buddy and you just followed him on the truck, just make sure you know where you hunted so you can report that back to DNR. And we're not trying to steal your hunting spot. We're not going in to find your big bucks. We just need to know where it was harvested in case it's positive. So.
Yep. Great tips. And I'm just putting the link for the Recreation Compass in the chat. And fantastic. Let me see. Just a couple of last things. Yeah, we kind of went over the visual symptoms of CWD. It's that emaciated look. It's walking in circles. It looks like something's wrong, right? Like it doesn't. They're doing things that deer don't normally do. So, but by the time they get to that, it's been up to
2
3
to 3
years.
years. Yep. And I will say, if you harvest a deer, you have to tag it. So if you harvest it and you walk up on it later and it looks sick, you still have to tag it. You still have to register it. If you have concerns, talk to a conservation officer, but you can't bring a sick deer into the station, into a check station, and expect that we'll be able to reimburse anything. None of us are conservation officers. So if you harvest that deer and it looks sick, come talk to us or conservation officer, and but don't, just putting that out there.
I am seeing a couple of questions that are kind of related to deer hunting, but not necessarily CWD. Like how long is the rut? How many days is it? We've got a lot of great information on our Learn to Deer Hunt series that we did last fall. We cover the annual cycle on that stuff. Please check out those videos. We got a ton of stuff up on the website, but we're running out of time here. We're coming up to 1 o'clock. Kelsie, thank you again so very, very much. Everybody that's on the call, thank you for tuning in. Tune in next week. We're going to still be talking about deer, and y'all, get out in the woods, be safe, be responsible, and have fun. So thanks so much. And Kelsie, I'm gonna take us into the green room, and we'll wrap it up. Thanks everybody. Have a great day.